Welcome to this deep dive. We've got a really interesting stack of sources in front of us today, provided by you, our listener.
That's right, and we're going to be exploring a musical form with a history that's, well, let's just say it's anything but straightforward.
Definitely.
Oh.
We're plunging into the world of the Sarabande.
It's a form that went through some truly dramatic changes, sparked quite a bit of controversy, and ultimately became capable of incredibly profound expression.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Our mission, really, is to pull out the most important insights from these sources you sent and understand the Sarabandes' surprising journey.
Yeah, we're talking about something that started off seen as wildly scandalous.
Right, and then it transformed into a cornerstone of Baroque music.
And ended up as a symbol of deep emotion. It's quite a transformation, really.
So where do we even start? The sources suggest the very beginning is a bit murky and pretty scandalous.
It is indeed. The earliest known reference we have to something like Sarabande pops up in 1539 in Panama, actually, Central America, in a poem. But the sources also float other ideas about where it might have come from, maybe Spanish with Arab influences, perhaps ties back to ancient cults like Dionysus, or Moorish roots.
Even a link to an African deity.
Yeah.
Lots of possibilities.
A whole mix. And in those early days, what was it like?
The descriptions paint a picture of something, well, lively, energetic.
Yeah, often performed by couples in a double line, frequently with castanets. Think vibrant, popular, and probably quite uninhibited compared to later forms.
And that uninhibited nature, I imagine, led to some serious pushback.
Absolutely. The language used in the sources is remarkable strong. It was called indecent, loose in its words, ugly in its motions.
Wow.
There was a Jesuit priest, Juan de Mariana, who claimed it could excite bad emotions in even very decent people.
That's quite a statement.
And Cervantes famously wrote that hell was its birthplace and breeding place.
Goodness. So the overwhelming perception was one of obscenity, a lascivious character, as the sources put it.
Exactly. Sounds intense, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah.
Was there an attempt to, suppress it?
Yes, a significant one. In 1583, King Philip II in Spain issued a strict prohibition against the sarabande.
A ban. With penalties.
Yes, severe penalties for anyone caught performing it.
But if it was so popular, I'm guessing that didn't completely work.
It didn't, no. The sources note that despite the ban, it just kept being performed. And it shows up repeatedly in literature.
Which really speaks to its deep popular appeal, its resilience.
Definitely.
So these murky origins, the intense condemnation, a ban that couldn't quite kill it. What do the sources suggest all this tells us about the sarabande?
Well, this is a key insight from the sources. They interpret this not just as historical confusion, but as reflecting something deeper. A cultural struggle, maybe, over identity and legitimacy.
A threat.
The strong condemnation suggests it was perceived as a direct threat to the established social and religious order, and its association, with enslaved people, black dance, the lowest classes.
Right, that highlights anxieties about race, class, morality.
Exactly, all converging around this dance. And the fact that it survived suggests it might have also been a form of cultural resistance for marginalized groups,
Right.
sort of defying control.
That has a whole other layer. And there's that debated theory you mentioned, connecting it to an African deity.
Yes, it's a fascinating idea presented in the sources. The theory suggests Sarabande could be the name of an African deity, a protector of travelers.
Linking it to the slave trade rhythms.
Potentially. Linking the rhythm and dance to those forced journeys, the suppression by the Inquisition could even be tied to efforts to wipe out non-Christian religions. As one musicologist, Ruben Dubrovsky, characterizes it in the sources, it's the most beautiful misunderstanding of music history, suggesting that the standard European narrative, often written by those who won, might obscure these important non-European, perhaps even subversive roots.
And early writings linking it to lowest classes and non-whites seem to support that idea of cultural appropriation, maybe a sanitization process.
That's the interpretation offered, yeah. A history written by the victors, perhaps obscuring its origins.
Okay, so it started out controversial, incredibly popular, possibly with these deep marginalized roots, even got banned. Now, here's where it gets really interesting, because it didn't die out. It transformed and began to spread.
Exactly. From Spain and its colonies, it traveled. It went to Italy in the 17th century, popping up frequently in Spanish guitar music there.
Okay.
Then it made its way to France around the early 17th century. There's even a tale, maybe apocryphal, about Cardinal Richelieu dancing it in 1635.
Richelieu dancing the sarabande. What a thought. And France really seems to be the place where the big change happened, the transformation point.
That's what the sources strongly indicate. Around 1650, maybe a bit earlier, particularly at the court of Louis XIV, with composer Lully being key.
What changed?
Its tempo significantly slowed down. It evolved into something described as slow, dignified, graceful, and majestic. A proper court dance.
And it established itself with that slow triple rhythm, 34-32 time.
That's right. That became its defining feature in this new courtly context.
So a dramatic shift from fast and wild to slow and stately. Did the lively version disappear completely?
It seems a more energetic version did persist for a time, particularly in England, according to the sources. But the slow, stately form is the one that became dominant across much of Europe, especially on the continent.
And this is where it finds its place in the Baroque musical suite, that collection of dances.
Precisely. It was widely adopted as a stylized dance form in instrumental suites, usually written in binary form, meaning two main sections, each typically repeated.
And its position in the suite.
It commonly took the third position, after the allemande and courante and before the gigue. This structure became pretty standard, particularly in the German High Baroque.
Were there variations in this stately form across Europe? Was it always the same slow tempo?
No, the sources point out it wasn't entirely uniform. In Italy, for instance, composers like Corelli and Vivaldi sometimes wrote Sarabandes that felt a bit faster, maybe closer in spirit to a courante.
Even later on.
Yeah, even into the mid-18th century sometimes. But generally, that slow, solemn, dignified character associated with the privileged classes was the one that gained widespread acceptance from the mid-17th century onwards.
And it wasn't limited to just instrumental suites, right?
Yeah.
You'd hear it elsewhere.
No, absolutely. It appeared in ballet de corps ballets and as stage dances in French and German operas, often used for allegorical figures or maybe love scenes, ceremonial moments.
Did people keep dancing it for long?
Actual dancers performing it on stage largely faded out around 1750, according to the sources. The musical form, though, lived on.
How do the sources interpret this dramatic transformation? From scandalous folk dance to stately court music.
This is another key insight. They often see it as a deliberate courtly filter, a process that took a popular, possibly subversive form and reshaped it to fit the decorum and aesthetic values of the aristocracy.
So taming the wildness.
Kind of, yeah. And the variations across countries show this transformation wasn't monolithic. Its formal acceptance and place in the suite signify its institutionalization. It was, you could say, stripped of its perceived vulgarity and scandalous past.
And became respectable.
Exactly. Respectable, even profound, successfully integrated into the dominant cultural narrative.
It truly is remarkable how a single dance form could undergo such a radical change in character and status. Let's shift focus a bit to the music itself. What defines the sarabande musically, especially in that later, stately Baroque form?
Okay, so the core identity is definitely that stately, slow tempo and triple meter, most often 34-32 time signature.
Right.
But its most distinctive feature, the absolute hallmark, is a strong accent or stress on the second beat of the measure.
The second beat, that feels different in triple time. Usually the first beat is strongest.
It does, doesn't it? And this emphasis is typically created musically in a couple of ways, often through a dotted note on the second beat, stretching it out, or sometimes a note that's held or tied over from the second beat into the third.
Any other rhythmic quirks?
Well, unlike many other Baroque dances, it usually begins directly on the first beat. There's typically no anacrusis, no pickup note leading into the first bar. Straight in.
What is that strong push on the second beat due to the character of the music? How does it make it feel?
It gives it a very deliberate, expressive quality. It feels measured, maybe introspective, certainly dignified. The sources connect this directly to descriptions of long notes and what they call sighing or weeping figures.
So a direct link between rhythm and emotion.
That's the idea. It creates a sense of suspension, maybe a kind of musical inhalation on the first beat, and then this sustained, perhaps slightly delayed exhale on the second. A pause, almost.
Is there a reason for this emphasis on the second beat? Does it relate back to the actual dance steps?
It does. That's a key point in the sources. The rhythmic emphasis on the second beat is widely seen as a direct musical echo of the original dance's physical movements.
Specifically?
Specifically, a remnant of what were apparently called drag steps. The music prolonging that second or third part of the beat reflects these particular physical actions from the dance.
That's fascinating. The music is literally reflecting the choreography, like sonic choreography, as one source puts it.
Exactly. This halting rhythm, this deliberate wait or pause on the second beat, is what gives the Sarabande its characteristic feeling of calm, contemplation, and reflection.
And the melodies contribute, too.
Yes, its melodies often feature long, sustained notes, which adds to that introspective quality.
And this contemplative quality is why Baroque composers, valued it so highly.
Precisely. The Sarabande was esteemed, the sources say, for its capacity to move the passions, the feelings of the listener. It was often reserved for moments of emotional intensity.
So it was seen as a vehicle for profound feeling, beyond just being a dance form.
Absolutely. And the sources point out the paradox here. This seemingly simple, halting rhythm is precisely what allows for such deep emotional resonance. It creates a contemplative space where emotions can unfold slowly and, well, profoundly.
Was this rhythmic structure completely rigid in the Baroque era? Or was there some flexibility?
Not entirely rigid, no. Baroque music wasn't governed by absolutely strict rules in the way we might think. It was more guided by a body of traditions, principles, effects, and conventions.
Good taste, basically.
Yes, composers were guided by what was considered good taste in their specific time and place. This allowed for variation based on epochs, places, and composers.
So a sarabande written in France might feel different from one written in Italy, even if they're both called sarabande.
Precisely. French composers generally tended towards a slower, more deliberate sarabande, while earlier Italian ones could imply a faster feel, maybe closer to that crante tempo we mentioned.
And even the way it was written down, the notation, could hint at these differences.
Yeah, the notation itself could function like a cultural dialect. A 34-time signature in France might suggest a different tempo or feel than, say, a 64 in Italy.
So understanding these nuances is crucial for performers today, what they call historically informed performance.
Very much so, trying to recreate the spirit and feel intended by the composer within their specific cultural context using these clues.
Now, we absolutely have to talk about Bach. The sources describe his Sarabandes as holding a privileged place.
For very good reason, yes. Bach often placed the sarabande right at the heart of his suites, whether they were for cello or keyboard.
When you hear the term sarabande today, you might immediately think of his famous 6 cello suites, or the solo violin partitas.
That's right. They're probably the most famous examples for many people.
His sarabandes for solo instruments are particularly renowned. How did Bach approach the form? What did he do with it?
Well, Bach took this stylized dance form and used it almost like a laboratory for expressive possibilities. He explored its potential for depth and introspection, often pushing the limits of what a single instrument could convey.
How so? Like in the cello suites?
Across his cello suites, for example, you see him trying different approaches, different ways to highlight that crucial second beat, different ways to create texture and imply harmony.
So he didn't just repeat the same pattern in each suite.
Not at all. In some, like the Sarabande from the first cello suite in G major or the third in C major, he uses full chords on the second beat. That gives the emphasis a really solid weight and clear structure.
Okay.
But then you look at the fifth suite, in C minor, he strips it right back. It's almost entirely a single melodic line, hardly any chords.
But the sarabande feel is still there.
Yes. The rhythm, that pull towards the second beat, is still subtly suggested. It creates this incredible sense of deep intimacy. Cellists have found profound meaning in this single line. One source quotes Rostropovich, calling it the essence of Bach's genius. Another quotes Tortelier, describing it as an extension of silence.
Extension of silence. For a dance that started out being called ugly motions and indecent, that really highlights how far the form traveled in his hands.
It truly does. And then the sixth suite shows yet another approach. It reaches a kind of culmination of polyphony, implying multiple voices with 3- and 4-part chords, using different rhythmic figures like subdivisions and suspensions.
So he was constantly experimenting within the form.
Absolutely. Even in seemingly simpler works, like the Sarabande from his English Suite No. 6 for keyboard, which the sources describe as having a rare melodic plainness, there's an intentional simplicity, a tranquil flow that still creates depth.
So the sources see this as showing a clear development in his work, using the sarabande to explore.
Yes, they point to a developmental trajectory. Using the sarabande to explore different textures, different expressive potentials. It's about mastering stylization, really transforming a dance form into complex musical thought.
And they highlight the paradox that he could achieve such depth, sometimes through stark simplicity, not just complexity.
Exactly. Like in the Fifth Cello Suite or that English Suite number 6. Sometimes it's the power of suggestion, the way he implies things that's so profound. The essence of Bach's genius, as that quote says.
Bach also took the Sarabande beyond the structure of a suite, right? Used it in other contexts.
Crucially, yes. This is really important. He deployed it for pivotal moments of profound emotional intensity in his sacred works.
Like the Passions.
Yes, the final choruses of both the St. John Passion and the St. Matthew Passion are essentially Sarabandes in character and rhythm.
Wow. Bringing the Sarabande into the Passion story. That must have elevated its meaning even further, giving it immense weight.
It certainly did. It demonstrates the Sarabande's capacity for immense solemnity and spiritual gravitas, far, far removed from its original dance function.
How do the sources interpret this use?
They see it as elevating the form to a sacred climactic role, perfectly suited as a musical lament for the sorrow and spiritual weight of the Passion narrative. It shows how he harnessed the emotional core of the form, that contemplative, sighing quality, to create a powerful bridge between music and spiritual reflection.
Did he use it elsewhere?
Briefly in some organ works, like a chorale prelude. And there's debate about whether some harpsichord concertos or transcriptions that might have originally featured Sarabandes.
Now, how did Bach's meticulous approach to writing music compare to other composers at the time? You mentioned notation earlier.
That's another interesting point from the sources. Unlike many contemporaries who expected performers to add their own improvised embellishments and ornaments,
Which was common then.
very common, Bach, however, tended to notate precisely everything he wished to have played. He wrote out a lot of the ornamentation.
Did everyone appreciate that level of detail?
Not always. This precision sometimes drew criticism. There's a famous critique from Johann Adolf Scheib, who felt Bach's style had an excess of art, that it overloaded the music and completely covered the melody with too much intricate detail.
But the sources suggest that even his simple Sarabandes, the ones Scheib might have preferred, were anything but plain in their construction.
Exactly. Even something that sounds simple on the surface, like that English Suite number 6 Sarabande, was incredibly carefully crafted. It shows intentional simplicity and tranquil, beautiful voice leading.
And there's this idea of latent polyphony.
Yes, especially in the seemingly single-line pieces, like for solo violin or cello. His Sarabandes often imply complex harmonies or multiple independent melodic lines woven together, even when only one note is sounding at a time. It's sometimes called hidden homophony or latent polyphony.
So you might only hear one line, but your ear perceives or completes a richer texture.
Precisely. It's a profound skill evoking complexity with minimal means. The sources interpret this as part of Bach's unique control and vision. His Sarabandes are seen as these fully realized musical statements where the profundity is built right into his design.
Transforming the movement into an intellectual and emotional puzzle, almost.
You could say that, exploring the very essence of music with seemingly simple tools.
Okay. We've traced its wild origins, its transformation into courtly elegance, its rhythmic core, and Bach's incredible use of the form. Let's briefly circle back to what the Sarabande was actually like as a dance in that Baroque court setting.
Right. We need to remember it became that slow, dignified court dance by the mid-17th century. The technical side, the steps, involved specific, highly controlled movements.
Not wild and energetic anymore.
No. Think precise footwork steps like coupé, bourrées, contretemps, even pirouettes. Often rapid steps, actually, but requiring a lot of control to look graceful and stately.
And how did the music connect directly to those steps?
The link was fundamental. The sources describe how dancers would typically perform bends or plays on the upbeat of the music, and then rise up, or élèves, on the downbeat. This directly tied the physical movement to the musical pulse, especially that characteristic second beat emphasis.
Were there other characteristic movements?
Yes, specific arm movements and an outward rotation of the legs, which, interestingly, became foundational techniques for classical ballet later on.
These weren't large group dances anymore, like the early descriptions.
No, typically they were dances adieu, performed by just one couple at a time, and they were designed to be watched, often from the top of the hall, where the highest-ranking members of the court, like the king, were seated.
The sources interpret this as more than just simple entertainment, right? There was a social meaning.
Yes, very much so. They see it as a performative expression of social hierarchy and court etiquette. It reinforced order, displayed status, grace, control. It was a way for nobles to, perform their rank.
A visual and kinetic representation of courtly power, almost.
That's a good way to put it.
So the connection between the music and the dance was really deep. You couldn't separate them.
Absolutely essential in that context. The Sarabandes' music was composed to influence and reflect the movement. Dance notation systems developed at the time, like the Beauchamp-Fille's system, clearly show this close interplay between the musical rhythm and the specific choreography.
And the music provided the foundation.
Yes. The basso continuo, that steady foundational bass line and harmony, provided the crucial rhythmic anchor for the dancer's precise steps. And you saw dance sequences, divertissement, featuring Sarabandes and operas by composers like Lully and Rameau, showing how integrated music and dance were in Baroque performance.
It really sounds like the music was, as you said before, a form of sonic choreography.
That's a great phrase for it, and an interpretation highlighted by the sources. To truly understand a Baroque sarabande, especially from that era, you need to consider its potential for movement. The rhythm, the harmony, they're tied to the grace and precision of the Baroque dance aesthetic. It was a holistic expression.
Okay, we've covered its wild origins, its courtly transformation, its rhythmic heart, Bach's genius, and its life as a dance. What about some of the more intriguing curiosities and how the sarabande still resonates with us today? Any final interesting bits from the sources?
Well, let's just quickly revisit some of those early moments we discussed. The ban in Spain, those descriptions calling it indecent, even I think one source mentioned Kurt Sachs calling it a sexual pantomime, and Cervantes linking it to hell.
Right, and the sources see this history as making it a symbol of subversion.
Exactly. It speaks to its resilience, doesn't it? Its defiance of attempts to control popular culture. The fact that it didn't die out, despite all that condemnation, shows its enduring appeal.
And that theory linking it to an African deity, Sarabande, protector of travelers.
Yes, that remains a compelling, if debated, idea presented in the material. The thought that this dance might be linked to the music of Tanzanite Slaven, the music of dancing enslaved people, and could somehow echo centuries later in Bach's Passions. Well, that's a powerful, almost staggering thought.
What's the key insight from that interpretation in the sources? Why is it important?
It's really about reclaiming a hidden narrative, isn't it? Challenging a purely Eurocentric view of music history. The idea that this music, possibly originating with enslaved people, could undergo this transformation and eventually appear in Bach's most sacred works is deeply ironic and profound. It highlights a complex spiritual and social lineage that's often overlooked or perhaps even suppressed in standard histories.
Does the sarabande actually show up in our culture today? Do people still engage with it?
Oh, absolutely. It has a remarkable, enduring appeal, often through modern adaptations. One of the most recognizable examples is probably Handel's Sarabande.
Ah, the one from Stanley Kubrick's film Barry Lyndon.
Precisely. That film back in 1975 gave Handel's Sarabande from his keyboard suite in D minor massive recognition. It really cemented its place in the popular consciousness as this piece of profound, stately, maybe slightly melancholic music.
And Elgar's Nimrod. It's not explicitly called a sarabande, but the sources make a connection there too.
They do. Edward Elgar's famous Nimrod variation from his Enigma variations, written in 1899, is composed as a Baroque sarabande, specifically using that characteristic emphasis on the second beat to create that sense of nobility and emotional depth.
And Nimrod is such a significant piece in British culture, isn't it? Often used at funerals, memorials, state occasions.
It is, and that really underscores the sarabande's powerful, almost archetypal capacity for conveying solemnity and deep emotion. Its themes were even adapted quite effectively by Hans Zimmer for the Dunkirk soundtrack in 2017, linking it again to themes of loss and resilience.
How do the sources interpret this modern use? What does it tell us?
They suggest the sarabande, or at least its core characteristics, has become a kind of cultural archetype for solemnity, reflection, and gravitas. Its specific rhythmic and melodic qualities seem to be ingrained in our collective consciousness. They instantly evoke certain emotions, even if people listening don't know its history or even its name.
It's even crossed into other musical genres, hasn't it? Not just classical or film scores.
It has, which is fascinating. John Lord of Deep Purple, the rock band, released a classical rock fusion album titled Sarabande back in 1976.
Right.
And Sting, more recently, did what the sources call a touching pop arrangement of Bach's D major Sarabande, likely from one of the cello suites.
So it's bridging what's sometimes seen as a gap between high art and popular culture.
That's exactly the interpretation offered. It shows its extraordinary versatility and accessibility. Its core emotional qualities can be reinterpreted in vastly different musical languages, continually finding new audiences and creating this dynamic dialogue between the past and the present.
And its influence extends indirectly too.
Yes, inspiring other art forms through works like Elgar's Enigma Variations, which itself has been choreographed, and its symbolic power is even reflected in things like the Sarabande Foundation, established by Lee Alexander McQueen, which supports creative projects using the name as a symbol of inspiration.
What an absolutely incredible journey for a musical form, from being called indecent and banned, potentially rooted in marginalized cultures.
Transforming into a symbol of courtly elegance, becoming a fundamental part of the Baroque musical language.
Elevated to profound emotional and spiritual heights by Bach.
And still resonating in film scores, rock albums, pop arrangements, and solemn ceremonies today.
A journey shaped, in large part, by that powerful, contemplative emphasis on the second beat. A subtle rhythmic quirk, maybe an echo of its dance past, that gave it such a unique character and set it apart.
Absolutely. That rhythmic signature is key.
Well, we hope this deep dive, based on the sources you provided, has given you some new insights, maybe some shortcuts to understanding this truly multifaceted musical form.
And perhaps to leave you with a final thought from the sources. Consider how this simple, halting rhythm, potentially born from defiant physical movement in scandalous circumstances, could evolve over centuries to become such a universal symbol. A symbol of sorrow, gravitas, and deep introspection, echoing all the way from those early dance halls to solemn memorials in the heart of Bach's most sacred works. It's quite something to reflect on.